Hello, everybody, and welcome to this last session in our interdisciplinary workshop on voluntary assisted dying. Tonight's session focuses on the question of evaluation, and we have some very distinguished speakers with us, whom we're very pleased to welcome. I'd like to express my acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the various lands on which we're located around the country, and to express my respect for elders past and present. As I said, tonight's session focuses on evaluation, and I'm going to, together with Camille's help, state the way in which we're understanding the problem. Following which we have a number of speakers. I'll introduce them briefly when we get to them, but they are Stephen Duckett, Helen Dickinson, Victoria Palmer, and Richard Huxtable. And Richard's joined us from the United Kingdom, so we're really pleased for the effort he's gone to. And we also have our panel, and I think everyone's met by this stage all the panel members. As I've said previously, we've asked the speakers not to present fully developed, rigorously elaborated arguments, but rather to focus on provocations that essentially establish an agenda for the conversation that follows. And in that conversation, we're asking people to join as freely and openly as they can. And that invitation extends to the participants as well as to the panelists themselves. So I'd ask you to think of your questions, maybe signal in the chat that you're interested in asking a question, or put up your hand and we'll invite you to contribute. Now I'm going to share my screen. If I can accept now, it somehow disappeared, so I've got to find another way to do that. So that's not desirable. Just give me a sec. This is the nightmare of the facilitator, where you have everything set up and then it doesn't happen. Here we go. So tonight, as I've said, our question is really one of the key aims of the project that we're involved in, which is how can we evaluate Victoria's voluntary assisted dying policy? That's the task, one of the key tasks that we've set ourselves in our project. And this is I'm seeking to state the problem here in the first couple of slides. Voluntary assisted dying represents a complex social policy that was put into effect by the Act of the Victorian Parliament in 2017 and became active in 2019. The Act itself, in section 116, states the obligation of a review to be undertaken by the Minister in the 5th year of operation, which is next year, and to reflect on the first 4 years of the operation of the Act. And the purpose of this review will be to assess the way in which the Act and the policies associated with it have operated, and to consider what, if any, changes need to be made. Now, the reason why this is an interesting and complex question is that voluntary assisted dying has effects at multiple levels of society. And we're focused on these in the various workshops during the course of this conference. There's the level of the personal experiences of the various individuals involved in the process, including the patients themselves, their families, their carers, professionals, health professionals, doctors, nurses, and others. There are the issues associated with the administration and regulation of the policy, which includes the law itself, the Voluntary Assisted Dying Review Board, and the various other administrative and bureaucratic processes. There are the more formal aspects of the law and regulatory questions, which to a large extent at this stage, I believe, haven't yet been put to the test. And then there were the questions that we talked about last night, the large-scale implications for medicine, society, culture and ethics. So how do you assess something that has so many components, so many facets to it? So this is a statement of how we see the problem that we're facing as researchers here. What's the appropriate methodology for assessing and reviewing a complex, multifaceted policy that's evoked vigorous public debate, often highly contentious, and initiated an extensive and ongoing process of social change? There's so much involved here to think about. And of course, the practical questions are what changes need to be made to the law and to the administrative arrangements to ensure that the VAD process operates fairly and effectively. I've just said fairly and effectively, both to indicate the levels of bureaucratic efficiency, if you like, but also the ethical domain within which those public debates have occurred. So in the last couple of slides here, I'm just going to give you an indication of how we've been thinking about it without going into any depth. We've been seeking to develop a complex evaluation instrument here that recognises the three domains that I've already mentioned, but acknowledges that we can think on different levels. I've mentioned here the rough ideas of micro, meso and macro. The micro are the personal levels of actual experience, the macro are the larger scale effects on society as a whole, and the meso reflects, at least in the way in which we're thinking about it here, the level of institutional control or regulation. And that means that we have to consider many different sorts of variables that are applicable to the people who enter the system in different ways and different capacities. That means that we've got to think of different ways of assessing these variables, different metrics, different assessment strategies, and that includes both qualitative and quantitative approaches. In the last slide, I'm just going to show you a list of the multiple variables that we've decided upon. I'm not going to go into these in any detail. Each one of these obviously involves a detailed description and an assessment or measurement process, but they include ways in which we understand suffering and whether the extent to which we're able to respond to different concepts of suffering, models of care, burdens on the various carers and other people involved, questions about ethics, some of the more formal administrative issues, financial costs, and so on and so forth. So you can see that we've sought to cover a wide array of issues with a recognition or acknowledgement of that complexity that I've been describing. So this is really the setting or the context in which we've asked a number of people to initiate the conversation tonight with some brief talks, and then we will seek your advice and assistance in sorting through these problems. Camille, do you have anything to add at this point, or are you comfortable with the way in which I've presented these questions?
Of course, Paul, that sounds really good. Thank you. Okay,
thank you for that. So our first speaker is Professor Stephen Duckett. Stephen's probably known to many of you. He's an honorary enterprise professor in the School of Population and Global Health at the University of Melbourne, and has just concluded a decade as director of the Grattan Institute's Health and Aged Care program in Melbourne. Stephen, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Paul, and I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So certainly this is a really complex example of a policy evaluation, and some of the dimensions were in that last slide that Paul put up. I just might mention that I've been involved in a number of aspects of the voluntary assisted dying, including mostly looking at the process for the legislation being passed. So even though there's a statutory requirement for evaluation, it doesn't actually talk about the purpose of an evaluation. And obviously the audience of the evaluation. Is the audience supporters of voluntary assisted dying or opponents of voluntary assisted dying? Is the purpose, is the objective of the evaluation about a formative one, that is to improve the way that voluntary assisted dying works? And in that context, it's important to remember the battles that were associated with voluntary assisted dying in Victoria and in other states, and the compromises that had to be made in that regard. And so obviously, because there were compromises, there are obviously going to be shortcomings in some people's views. So a formative evaluation would obviously say what worked, in inverted commas, and why not. Obviously, another dimension would be sort of some more descriptive or summative, including what did people think about, what do people now think about voluntary assisted dying and why? So given the experiences. And for those of you who, interestingly, today, I think in today's issue of the CMAJ, there's a very interesting case study of an experience of voluntary assisted dying that is actually published in the journal, very nicely written by a number of participants in a voluntary assisted, what they call medical assistance in dying. So what is policy evaluation, and what is the policy being evaluated is a critical thing that you need to address. Is the policy being evaluated about the provision of voluntary assisted dying? But we know that the availability of voluntary assisted dying gives some people comfort and they don't use it. There's a number of studies overseas which have shown that people who have applied for voluntary assisted dying haven't used it, and they just wanted it as a backup stroke comfort, and so on. So it's really important to clarify what is you are evaluating. Are you evaluating the use thereof or the availability thereof, or some combination of both? That then brings you to another complex issue in this particular evaluation, is the design of the issue, the design of the evaluation. And it's the question is, are you evaluating, to what extent is your evaluation looking at people who used voluntary assisted dying versus those who did not use it, carers who involved in processes which used it versus did not use, because this is important in terms of one of the critical issues in the debate about voluntary assisted dying is the slippery slope argument. And so you do need to think about, did the provision of voluntary assisted dying change the processes for those who weren't even contemplating it? And that becomes quite a tricky part of an evaluation. And I think an important issue is the indirect effects of passage of the legislation, including the increased availability of palliative care. Did that actually happen? There were a lot of promises about that, and what are the consequences of that? So that the very passage of this legislation was important in changing the whole dynamics in this field. Finally, the framing of the evaluation, and one of the contemporary memes, I guess, is the so-called quadruple or quintuple aim. And so one of the issues is, and it's going to be a hard one to deal with, is this question of, is there a different experience for rural versus urban people? And again, that was an issue in some of the debates on the passage of the legislation, and also First Nations people versus not First Nations. And that was a very big issue in the Northern Territory introduction of voluntary assisted dying, the temporary introduction of voluntary assisted dying some time ago. And finally, you are looking at the provider experience, but which provider experiences are you looking at? Are you only looking at those who are approved providers of voluntary assisted dying, but what is the experience for other people who are not providers? Again, it's part of this slippery slope argument, the argument that voluntary assisted dying changes the dynamic of medicine irrevocably. So what I'm raising in these short remarks are about the framing and the context and the what's being evaluated question, because it is really, really complex given how complex this policy is. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Stephen. We might come back to you later to give us the view from the government's point of view of what sort of thing the department will be looking for and what their criteria of success might be. Our second speaker is Helen Dickinson. Helen is Professor of Public Service Research in the Public Service Research Group at the School of Business, University of New South Wales in Canberra. Helen, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Paul. I'd like to start by acknowledging I join you this evening from the land of the Bunurong people. Very stormy night at the moment. My internet's dropped out 3 times today, but hopefully it will hold. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land that was never ceded. So I'm going to talk about some stuff that's similar in some ways to Stephen, but from probably a slightly different angle. So I predominantly work in public management, public administration, and the kind of discussions that have gone on in that literature around evaluation. I'm going to use them to shape a couple of provocations that I'll talk about in the opening remarks. So in these fields, we've kind of long tried to evaluate both complicated and complex social and public policies and social reform initiatives. Although I think it's probably safe to say over the last few decades, they've probably become a bit more technocratic in nature, seeking to do the evaluation work in quite sort of narrow measures of efficiency and effectiveness. But in recent years, quite a few scholars have started to pose concerns on whether that's actually trying to measure the right sorts of things. And so some of those critiques come from the fact that the literature has often imposed what are very kind of Western values over other worldviews, but also in recognition that even in Western democracies, populations don't share a consistent views or priorities. And so I'm going to talk about this issue of value and values and a bit of a provocation around that. But also one of the things we've seen that I'm really inspired by in literature in recent years is this idea of developing a more humble approach to kind of public management. And so in a quote from Lowe, it's pointed out that we've created a public management process that kind of effectively routinely lies to itself because it's fixated on measurement, incentives and targets. And this quest for kind of rationality and order and knowing means that sometimes we focus on the wrong thing. So I guess my provocation is similar to Stephen's in some way in thinking about how we can make sure that we focus on the right sorts of things. And in doing this, I guess I'm starting from the principle that no evaluation approach is ever fallible, no matter how much money, how much time, how many resources you have. Every evaluation makes really important decisions about what to value and what not to value in setting up frameworks to measure success. So we can't measure all impacts. And we're going to make some really important trade-offs in deciding how to measure whether an initiative has been successful. And I guess for me, what marks out some more effective approaches is the acknowledgement that those trade-offs have been made, why they've been made. Sorry, my dog is joining in now. and acknowledging that any kind of approaches to measuring success are limited or partial. So knowing what to measure and how to integrate those and give weight to different factors is a really kind of key choice. And I guess one of the biggest issues that we get in that, as Stephen already mentioned, comes when we have kind of contradictory findings relating to different sorts of measures. And I guess one of the other challenges in a project like this is, you know, we have a public and policymakers who often want to know, did it work or not, in a rather simple and straightforward answer, when often the reality is a bit more complex and nuanced, that rather than just whether something kind of succeeded or not. So I'm going to start with this. So think now about this issue of value and values. And I guess at a macro level, often we've been concerned in public management with kind of economic kind of concerns. So we look at things like financial costs and efficiency, but we also, there's a number of other ways that value is created in terms of things like quality of life, impact on carers, impact on professionals, and implications for models of care. And so in the process of selecting what values to measure, it tells us quite a bit about what systems actually value, and how values are embedded within that macro structure. So we've known for a long time in public systems that what matters is what measures, and the very act of kind of focusing in on something and measuring it tells us about what's valued in a system. And so values are often implicit in evaluation approaches rather than explicitly talked about. But I think there's a number of really important, and Paul, you put these on the slide before, a number of important kind of values around things like caregiving, grieving, ethics, rituals, and things like that. And they can be more challenging to accommodate in evaluations, and are less clear cut than some other measures. They're quite normative, and so they're not necessarily consistently held, but it doesn't mean that they're less important. And these are the sorts of things that often individuals in the broader public are often kind of concerned with. So in recent years, we've done a lot of kind of co-productive approach with individuals who use various aspects of services, and Victoria, I'm sure we'll talk about some of this as well, to try and identify what matters to individuals who use those services. Sometimes they align really nicely with what the systems identify as being important, and sometimes they're really different. And so finding ways to make space for them in evaluation approaches can be a really good way to go to earn trust within systems, which, as we know, is really important to make the systems work. So in terms of this distinction between value and values, I think the key message for me is that the sorts of factors we select and say tell us that something's successful, tells us about what we value in terms of a system. I think sometimes that's quite uncontroversial, but where we've got these kind of highly normative issues, then it can create challenges within that. But if we don't do that, then it can also undermine some of the broader trust in the system. So you know, what we value tells us really important things about the values in that system. And I just want to wrap up by turning back to this issue of humility in terms of evaluation. So a really defining feature of this is kind of the willingness to appreciate that we don't know everything. We don't have all the answers, and that can be a really difficult kind of proposition where you're positioned as the expert who's going to find kind of the answer. But I think it's really important in being open to our own kind of limitations, you know, saying that we can make mistakes, and we're not necessarily locked into particular kind of decisions, and we acknowledge the limitations of any kind of approach that we develop or any knowledge that we develop out of that. So a real call for thinking about how can we kind of accommodate humility within our approaches to evaluation, be really clear about what the limitations are. As I said, all evaluations have these, no matter what their scope are. And so how can we leave space for some different kind of perspectives to come into play in evaluation processes? So I'll stop there before my dog starts singing again.
Thanks very much, Helen. That's great. Our next speaker is Victoria Palmer. Victoria is an expert in qualitative and mixed method research design and analysis, including participatory design. And she's the inaugural director of the Alive National Centre for Mental Health Research translation that's located at the University of Melbourne. Vicky, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks. Thanks, Paul, and thanks to Stephen and Helen for setting out some groundwork of provocations and things to think on. And as Paul mentioned, I lead a large national research translation centre in mental health, and one of our core areas and attempts has been to embed experience co-design at all levels. And I suppose that follows on quite nicely from your call there, Helen, around thinking about values and voices and co-production and all those processes that are critical to developing evaluation frameworks or co-evaluation frameworks and measures. So it's a very complex area, as you were alluding to in the beginning, Paul, and it's hard to think through the varying levels at which evaluation might be occurring, and thinking through what might be considered a public shift and a whole social movement, through to a public policy shift, through to the on-the-ground experiences, requires multiple theoretical frameworks and components. So I suppose one of the helpful frameworks that we draw on is more of the critical realist approach to evaluation, and thinking about what worked for whom and when and in what circumstance. And I think here that's going to be key to thinking through the impacts and the whole voluntary assisted dying process and the implementation of that policy and its evaluation. And then I suppose the other questions are around what will people be co-designing? Are they co-designing the evaluation itself? Are they co-designing the measures? Are they to what extent are people going to be involved in all of those processes? And then how will we engage people in the actual evaluation itself? So rather than staying at the level of involving people to get feedback on the measures and the variables, where we want to move to in co-design as well is thinking about how people might conduct research and co-analyse that data as well, and think about where people might want to draw attention to those implementation lessons. So these were the things that were coming to my mind as people were talking, and I suppose the key thing or my provocation or the perhaps part of the risk that we might need to consider is that tension between measurement and measurement frameworks and the highly relational space in which all of these experiences are occurring and all the processes are occurring. And that's always in tension when we start talking about measures and variables and outcomes and starting to take what is a highly subjective realm into an objective space. And I think part of the challenge, Paul, for you and the team and for this workshop is to think about not only the humility needed in the whole exercise, but the way in which there needs to be some level of accounting for that tension between the subjective and the objective, and some kind of space in between to acknowledge that the experiential is often overtaken in measurement approaches. So I think they're my key points, and I think the other place to consider is around what role explanatory theories might play, and models of change and theoretical frameworks, and these might help us to evaluate something so complex at multiple levels as equally as a measure and a measurement framework. So that would be my provocation for you to consider, and I'll hand it over to yourself and Richard. Thank you. Thanks
so much, Victoria. And our last speaker is Professor Richard Huxtable. Richard's a researcher and bioethicist who focuses especially on the legal and ethical issues in end-of-life decision-making, especially surgery and paediatrics. Richard, who's joining us from the United Kingdom, thank you very much for coming to us over such a very long distance, although it's made a bit easier by Zoom. Thank you very much, Richard. We're looking forward to hearing you talk.
Thank you, Paul. I do have some slides I will share, so I will bring those up now, or at least attempt to, so bear with me a second if you can. And there we go. Can I just check those are full screen for you?
Yes, that's perfect.
Fabulous, great. Well, as you might anticipate, and thanks very much for the invitation to speak to you today, we in the UK broadly don't have laws permitting assisted dying. But when invited by Cameron and Paul to speak to you, I thought, what valuable insights might we have from the UK? So I'm going to look back to some of the groups that have studied this phenomenon and indeed whether the UK should move in a permissive direction, as I think there are a few insights from there that might be valuable today. So I'm looking at a select group, particularly the House of Lords Select Committee that reported in 2005, the Commission on Assisted Dying reported in 2012, and more recently, last year, in fact, a citizens' jury on the island of Jersey. And I should, in keeping with some remarks I'll make later, declare that I applied unsuccessfully to serve as an advisor to the first group. I gave invited evidence to the second, and I did serve as one of several advisors to the citizens' jury last year. To give the game away, these are the essential conclusions each of those groups reached. So the Select Committee essentially reached no recommendation, a neutral position in view of the split amongst the 13 members of that committee. The other two groups, by majority, quite substantial majorities, argued in favour of allowing assisted dying in some form. So 11 of 12 commissioners on the Commission on Assisted Dying and 78% of the 23 jurors in Jersey. So how did they get there? Well, of course, one part of that story is looking to the evidence, and this has come through very clearly from the observations from the speakers a moment ago. So worth noting that all three of these groups did receive oral invitation from groups and individuals, and the first two at least also sought or otherwise obtained written evidence, and indeed undertook research visits to permissive jurisdictions that allowed assisted dying, as I say, in some form. But I think that's not the whole story. The evidence is not going to do all of the work. I think one of the central messages I'd like to reflect on is the people. And here I'm thinking both about those who gave said evidence, but also importantly, those who sat on these groups and reached the relevant evaluations. So there may be something telling in the fact that on the Select Committee, we had a mix of publicly known views amongst those sitting on that group. So amongst their members were Lord Joffe, who had proposed a permissive bill. And at the same time, also the group was joined by Baroness Laura Finlay, a palliative medicine consultant who publicly is known to be opposed to assisted dying. Contrast that and the fact it reached essentially no recommendation with the composition and input into the other two groups. So Lord Faulkner, who chaired the Commission on Assisted Dying, insisted that the group was independent, but there was some critical backlash, I'm sympathetic to it, that the dice were rather loaded from the outset. The commission had been proposed by the campaign group Dignity in Dying in favour of a change in the law. It had been co-funded by two individuals, at least one of which, the widely known author Terry Pratchett, was known to have strong views in favour of changing the law. And moreover, of the 12 commissioners, 9 were publicly known to be in favour. So lo and behold, that group, so composed, reached a conclusion in favour. And one might, with a degree of caution, reflect similarly to an extent on the citizens' jury. Now, there was a broad range of views amongst those advisors, of which I was one, but perhaps striking, although the jury insisted that views should be declared openly, and indeed in the day-to-day work of two advisors, they should exercise care and look objectively at matters. Those two day-to-day advisors themselves are known to be in favour. And moreover, the jurors themselves, roughly in the proportion that the end vote ended up as were drawn from a population and were themselves, in their views as known at the outset, in favour of allowing the practice. So that leaves me with 5 key questions, all of which I'm very aware from Paul's introduction and from the observations we've just heard, they're already in your mind. So I'll trot through these quickly, but certainly I've dwelt most on the how and the who, but I think there are pertinent questions, 5 broad groups. The first is the what, and this certainly came through from Stephen's remarks. What is it we're looking to evaluate? Is it compliance? Is it experience? Is it satisfaction? Is it effects and indeed side effects, whether anticipated in advance or not? Once we've resolved the goals, then how are we going to go about meeting said goals? What sorts of evidence or routes, groups, and so on are best going to enable us to answer our key evaluation question, or questions plural? The who message was certainly the central one for me. I think we need to think in terms of plurality and diversity, and that certainly came through from what Helen and Victoria were talking about. And I think linked to that, linked to some of those UK experiences, we need to think about transparency. Declarations of interests might be an important feature. And then, and again, this came through from the previous speakers, where involves not only thinking about what can we learn from other jurisdictions within certain caveats, but also how do we think about the population at large that said law is affecting? How do we attend to differences between rural and urban areas as one example? And the final is the when, and I'm reassured that your system has baked in from the outset, and I think rightly so, a regular evaluation or monitoring. And I think in addition to having regular appraisals like this, we need also to think, how do we pivot quickly if something should transpire? That means we need to look at the evidence and operation once again. So those are my opening remarks. Thanks again for the invitation, and I will stop the screen sharing there. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thanks for all of the speakers. This is quite a difficult conversation to chair because there are so many issues here. And I would just ask you to jump in however you like at any time. So please don't be hesitant to interrupt. I thought, just listening to the talks, there are different clusters of interest, of issues. And I think it might be worth just really thinking about whether this is something that can even be evaluated. And especially just thinking of what Richard was just showing us. It's very easy to stack an evaluation panel by choosing the people who have one view rather than another. And we know that the community is really quite divided on these issues. So is it even possible to talk about an evaluation? So I'd like really to think about that. And that really raises a question, I guess, about process, about what you actually do when you subject to public scrutiny something as important and complex as this. And in a sense, I think that's what we're doing in these sessions here. We're having public conversations that don't necessarily lead to specific outcomes, but that's a key question. And I'll ask some of the panelists to comment on that. I mentioned after Stephen's talk that I might ask him or ask other people what the objective of the, what the minister has in mind, or what the government had in mind when they passed the Act, and what the outcome would be. And from the point of view of the government or the administrative or bureaucratic apparatus, what sort of things would they be looking for in that setting? And then I thought a third cluster of issues would focus on what needs to change. And that might be the easiest because we've got a lot of people here with a lot of expertise about how the system is operating and what's working and what isn't. And I might ask individual people from different perspectives to comment on that. If you're happy if we proceed in that way, I'd be really keen to hear your responses. Ian Kerridge, do you mind if I start with you? With the kind of fundamental question, is it even possible to evaluate a policy as multifaceted and complex as this?
I think you'd have to say it better be possible. You know, because I borrowed that line from others, but it's but something so important has to be measurable in some way. We may debate the metrics and the things that we count as important, and I think that's where a big part of the discussion has to proceed, because the worst thing would be to have, you know, appalling assessment, because that's going to lose any sort of ethical credibility that this kind of policy will have. So I think it does have to be evaluable. I think I'd sort of go to something like the accountability for reasonableness framework, you know, as a starting point, you know, and this would be just a starting point. So just as there was effort put into making establishment of policy and law in this area ethically credible to start with, and it was recognised that that was going to be absolutely crucial, the same is going to be true moving forward, for assessing it, for revising it, for reforming, to suggesting revision at any point. If they're lacking in ethical probity, then the whole thing is arguably sunk. So you know, some of the markers, it would be, you know, the evaluation has to be inclusive. There has to be agreement about what evidence counts and what evidence is important and whose evidence counts and how's it's counting. It has to be transparent, and then arguably it has to also be clearly actionable. So everyone has to understand what will happen to the evaluations, who's going to take into account the evaluations, what meaning is going to be attached to those evaluations, you know, or are they just going to disappear if the evaluations are rigorously done on agreed metrics, transparently done, and they're very inclusive, but then they go nowhere because we've got a corrupt political process, we have a problem. So I think all of those things, and maybe starting with that Daniels and Sabin type accountability for reasonableness, would be a good start. But that's the beginning of a discussion, not the end of it.
Thank you. Ian Olver, can I ask you to reflect on this? I know you personally have some significant reservations about the whole concept of voluntary assisted dying. Do you think the dice, as Richard presented in his picture, do you think the dice are stacked against people who are asking probing questions about the very underlying concept here?
Well, I think that's why it's important to start talking about the evaluation, because essentially those that raised arguments for or against, or possibilities of favourable or unfavourable consequences of legislation, both of those things have to be evaluated as part of a proper evaluation of the voluntary assisted dying, and it has to be quite broad. I think Stephen mentioned the issue of one of the things that some jurisdictions did was said, look, we've listened to arguments about requiring good access to palliative care and palliative care counselling. So part of introducing this would be to increase the funding for that. Well, that's part of the evaluation, because if that hasn't happened, then something that may mitigate some of the concerns of people that people had before the introduction of the legislation won't have been addressed. So we've got to look at this very broad thing. I like the idea that it'll be both quantitative and qualitative. It's the only way to evaluate this type of a thing. So it's the breadth and the addressing the concerns and of both sides of the argument, if you like, that will speak to the success of the evaluation, the credibility of the evaluation to across the breadth of society.
Thank you. And I keep, as I've asked several times, please just interrupt as you wish. Don't wait to be asked by me. Cameron Stewart. Cameron, how do you evaluate a law or a piece of legislation?
Well, there's quite a number of established techniques, and Australia's got a long tradition of doing law reform evaluation. But but it does it in similar ways to the processes that that Richard's talked about. There's normally public consultation is the primary way that this sort of thing happens. I do think there's something substantially different about law reform to other types of sort of normative positionings that you might see in a policy or that you might see in an ethical position statement, because it's not so. There's very little that the law can do in terms of what it does to encourage forms of behaviour. So very good at saying that behaviour is permitted or behaviour is not permitted, and it's good at licensing, requiring sort of licensing, requiring people to do certain things in order, but it can't really create any pictures of excellence. So if after, I'd imagine when we get to a certain level of maturity for these systems, and there's a discussion about the profession of whatever it's going to be called, is it going to go back to palliative care, or is it going to be called thanatology, or whatever it's going to be? Those are the people that are going to have to talk about how to do this well and how to do this excellently. It won't be the lawyers that do that. So I think, yeah, there's an important distinction then between looking at the levers that you can use for law, which are instrumental, and then the deeper issues about how one does these things really well. And I think that's probably more your sort of policy or your ethical statements, or the profession, whatever the profession is going to become. It's speaking to itself about what it expects in terms of, dare I say, virtues or forms of excellence in the practice of that of voluntary assisted dying.
Okay, thank you. There's a fundamental question, of course, about how the law stands in relation to changing opinions and perspectives and vigorous differences of opinion within the community, such as in a very contentious issue like this. Richard, and then we've got Peter.
Yeah, thank you. 3 or 4 fairly brief observations, picking up initially on what Ian was observing. So I think it must be conceivable and feasible to run some form of evaluation, but I would emphasize that message I had of the what, and I think it could be plural whats, but we need to nail down what is it we're seeking to evaluate, and that in turn might lead to a variety of methods in order to reach all the said goals. The second would be, and this was drawing on some experience with the citizens' jury, and all this information is publicly available on their website. They had very clear, robust and very detailed ground rules, almost rules of engagement, how they were going to run the exercise, what they expected in terms of witnesses and jurors as to how they comported
Sorry to interrupt,
themselves.
Richard. Could you just explain the concept of the citizens' jury for those who are familiar with it?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially a representative, so for that specific exercise, a representative group demographically of the citizens of Jersey, the jurisdiction in question, and they also sought to be representative of views on assisted dying across the island as well. Hence, it was rather loaded in favour of permissive views. But broadly, that group comes together. I think on that occasion, they came together over 10 sessions over a period of 2 or 3 weeks, with 2 or 3 speakers each time, sometimes some homework, periodic breaks to have an initial vote, thrash out the pros and cons of that vote, and then right at the end, the formal votes where they then offered up their views and a detailed report. So it ended with a report. So that was that process. But as I say, very clear rules of engagement there in terms of declaring interests, being respectful of one another, particularly mindful of diversity of views. And I think I'd stop with the reflection that Ian also introduced about credibility. And I just think in the background here is a clear question of trust. We're talking about very powerful and important social institutions. So law on the one hand, but also the health professions, plural, on the other. And so if we run the risk of going in the opposite direction and not evaluating or appraising what we're doing, I just think of the potential damage to trust, damage to lawmaking, damage to engagement with health professions. So we might end up doing the wrong thing in the wrong ways, but we need to do something.
Thank you. Peter, and then Victoria, then Stephen.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Look, I'm fairly optimistic that we'll come up with a very good framework that is balanced and objective. I suppose my concern is who might fund it. I'm just thinking about, palliative care. We've had Senate inquiry, a decade ago, we've had parliamentary inquiries and Auditor General's report. We've had a Grattan Institute report, all advocating for increased funding and resources. And palliative care is not particularly controversial. I think it's well accepted by the community by and large. So we've had difficulty attracting funds and resources to palliative care. And I suppose my concern is, even if we come up with a really good framework, how do we convince, and we haven't discerned which body might actually fund it, how do we convince a certain body to actually fund a framework that ideally, I think most of us would agree, would ideally be something that's done in an ongoing way, prospective way.
Thank you. Victoria.
Is that me? Is it Paul? Sorry.
Yep.
I just put into the chat about thinking about those principles of participation when the citizens, the juries were mentioned, and that need to really carefully consider those engagement processes for the evaluation. And I suppose, we've chatted before about the importance of co-design in the current healthcare system and quality improvement and service improvement and all those elements, and here it's no different. But I think understanding those processes and really thinking through how will we establish some principles and values that can be shared through the evaluative process will help to guide the way as well, equally. So we don't arrive at the evaluation and then have all of the agendas kind of driving the process, all the work being done now and leading up to the evaluation time and its implementation is critical in that process. So that was just a bit of more of a reflection rather than any helpful comment. But I did want to return us back to that tension as well, Paul, between that relational and the evaluative tendency for looking for the outcome and what will be the outcomes that are looked for in this evaluation in particular. And I think that's going to be a challenge.
Thank you. It is a helpful comment. Stephen.
Thanks, Paul. I've got a couple of comments. First of all, it's a long, long time ago that social science gave up the view that it was entirely value-free. So obviously every person who's going to participate in this evaluation comes from a particular position. Whether they've got an articulated position about voluntary assisted dying or not, who knows. So that means it's important to be overt about what the underlying value basis is. The second point I'd make is that there are two different sorts of things that might be behind the view that there needed to be an evaluation. The first is that during the debate on voluntary assisted dying in every jurisdiction, including Victoria, there was extensive discussion about the risks. And the risks were of a number of kinds, the slippery slope risk, most obviously, but there are other risks that were articulated in the parliamentary debates and to some extent in the submissions. And I, as I said to you before, have written a paper on that very issue. So clearly part of any evaluation is to what extent were these risks that were potentially going to arise, have they arisen? And to evaluate that, you have to be really open and honest to actually see if you can find those risks, because they were very serious risks, but by and large, Parliament obviously decided that the risks of the risks were lower than the risks of not legislating. So that's the first point. The second point is, to some extent, government might be open to saying this legislation was passed with the most stringent controls in the world. And that, I think, was necessary to get the legislation passed. The question is, have those most stringent restrictions in the world hindered the operation of the process, or have they been worthwhile protections? And so this question of, to what extent can you do a technocratic evaluation of the processes, which to some extent is saying this is what you set out, this was the intent of the legislation, these are the processes, because the legislation is very prescriptive of the processes. is this working? And to give an example, which is not in the legislation, is the question of telehealth. What we're seeing over the last couple of years is there are things that are happening in the wider environment which impact on this legislation. So there are all sorts of things like that, which I put aside from the risk question in terms of a formative approach to making the legislation work better. So when I say, so coming back to the question you asked right at the start of this conversation about what government is interested in, I think government is interested in what the risks were, and is there anything that can be done to address those if they are there? And secondly, is there any way to improve the legislation or to improve the processes, as well as the do people like it and those sorts of things.
Can I chip in there, Paul?
Yes, please go ahead.
I wanted to, I guess, just articulate the thing that I think is underlying some of our comments but hasn't actually been said, and that is that a number of the process type things are relatively easy to evaluate. You can count how long it takes to first request to second request, etc. You can count, how many people get palliative care, those sorts of things. But the hard pieces, such as, have vulnerable people become more vulnerable, or has medicine changed in how it's conducted as a result of this, are much harder to evaluate. And so there's a risk there as well, I think, that that we can do the easy bits and then the hard bits, which are perhaps the as Stephen said, maybe they were some of the things that were to be protected, but they are going to be harder to measure or to understand, and so perhaps get overlooked. And the only other comment I wanted to say is, in an evaluation, there is another risk, I guess, of, again, sort of some of the polarisation that characterised the debate leading up to the legislation being passed, perhaps being rekindled. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. Naomi Katz, you've made an interesting point in the chat. Would you like to talk?
Thanks very much, Paul. Yeah, not sure that there's a lot more than in there. I mean, I think the first point, there's two things, lots on my mind, but two things that I've sort of tried to articulate there. And one, I think, is an extension of, or Jen's articulated more clearly, and then an extension of that it's the experiential stuff is incredibly difficult to capture, but then this is an area, and like we see so much in palliative care where I work, but in many areas, that the one experience can look and be experienced and feel very differently by different people depending on who's giving the evaluation. And I guess that's just another complexity in such a polarizing and charged area like this, within the one family, and then within the patient clinician relationship, and then more broadly at a systems or legal level. And I don't know how to get my head around that when you've got two people that are staunchly different in how they see, what values and priorities they have, other than saying, well, we just see things differently, and therefore we have a right to see things differently and have different needs. But I guess I wonder about, interested in how we kind of capture that. And then it's one thing to evaluate something and see that there are differences, but then what do we do with that? And I guess that's an added challenge. And I guess the other thing I find myself thinking, and I really don't know if there's any relevance or importance to it, but thinking about a lot of the last few years and I guess the discomfort and the rhetoric around the healthcare space, but palliative care in particular, when clinicians are feeling like they're being asked to deliver something that they we're being asked by families and patients and consumers, or whatever language we want to use, to work out how to deliver something, and also by government. It's not a what do you think about this, but it's going to happen, and therefore how is it going to happen, not should it happen. And it just feels like it's a different space in medicine and how we interact with the world around us compared to where we've been in the past. And I'm just interested on people's reflections about that, because I don't know if it's relevant, but it just feels like maybe it's just an emotional response potentially for people that's different in this space. So yeah, thanks Paul.
Yeah, thank you very much. It seems to me that there are multiple evaluations, not just one, and that they actually serve or can serve very different sorts of purposes. And I think we have to think about what the government would want out of it, and I'd like to talk about that in a second. But I'm wondering if the evaluation process could be used to generate a kind of dialogical process that becomes a social learning process where people actually enter into dialogue around positions that were previously considered to be irreconcilable. That's really been one of the real blockages in this whole area of voluntary assisted dying, formerly in Australia called euthanasia, where people were entrenched in very extreme positions and unable to talk to each other. Is there some way in which we can release more respectful and more productive dialogue through this opportunity that we have that's opening up? Ian Kerridge.
Yeah, Paul, just to very quickly respond to that, I think we already have.
Yeah.
I mean, surely the fact that we've been able to get to this point has gone past, not all of it, but a lot of the entrenched positions and polemic that have characterised debate in this area for 30 years. The impression that I get, at least, and we've heard it on this symposium over the last week from people from within palliative care, is that the experience of seeing people receiving assistance in dying under the Act has been transformative for a number of people. It hasn't been, it hasn't shaken the entire world. Now they may still have the same position, but we have heard reflections that people are talking about shared values, care, compassion, equity, those sorts of things. So I think we're already in the space that we can talk productively about how to evaluate something in a very deliberative but a very broad fashion as well. And on that, I did also want to follow up Jenny's point, because I think it's a really important one. We've got so many examples where complex health policies have been evaluated on really simple metrics, right? Number of deaths, right? Time to discharge from hospital, these kinds of things, and terrible consequences in terms of health policy decisions or healthcare delivery sort of constructed around very poorly designed metrics. And there is a challenge there, isn't there? Because as Jenny described, the complex things, thinking about vulnerability, thinking about end-of-life care, they're hard to define. They're really hard to measure. It's difficult and complex to design methodologies that cope with those. They're certainly qualitative, but they may be ethnographic and anthropological as well. They're going to take advantage of social sciences and humanities resources, not simple kind of health metrics in a way. They're tough to do, and we can also frame them, those kinds of complex outcomes, in negative terms, i.e. have we made vulnerable people more vulnerable? But you can also frame them positively, right? I mean, has the assistance in dying legislation opened up conversations about structural racism in Australia in the way that COVID has? I think it has. Has it opened up interesting conversations about equity, or what end-of-life care looks like, or divisions between different professions or professionalism in medicine, the divisions between palliative care and assistance in dying. Again, I think it's fomented discussions, broader discussions that are not necessarily about assistance in dying, that have been arguably really important, and maybe the kinds of things that are really important going forward. So I would hope that we can perhaps broaden evaluation out beyond assistance in dying itself to actually take account of some of those things as well.
Thank you. So I've got Charlie and then Victoria and then Helen, and then I'll ask Nicole if she'd like to comment, and particularly on some of the things that Ian just said. And I noticed that Michael Ashby and Linda Sheehan are in the audience, and perhaps they'd like to comment after that. Charlie.
So I'd just like to endorse what Ian's just said, that this process, I think, is indicative of the ability to have a civil and sensible and thoughtful conversation about the issues. And I think we've come a long way. I just take one comment about your statement about how controversial and balanced the situation is, though, to make it clear that the population, more than 80% of the population in the surveys are regularly positive about voluntary assisted dying, and we obviously heard that in the context of Jersey as well. So the population is really very much over towards favour. We recognise that there are a number of people who are vehemently antagonistic, but they are a small minority. Their views need to be recognised. But I think the chances of this being repealed and the population accepting it are virtually nil. So although it is very controversial, it is overwhelmingly supported. And I think that it's important to be respectful of the views of those who are very uncomfortable about it, and make sure, as you've already said in the review, that we make sure that those things that are concerns are really carefully looked at. But I don't think it's a balanced problem.
Thank you. Victoria.
No, thanks, Paul. I just saw someone put in the chat about the bottom line about how the law works in practice, and talk to people and families who are involved in voluntary assisted dying and those deaths, and cut through the crap and ensure that so-called safeguards are not indeed obstructions to equitable access. And I think these are the key areas in evaluation of, again, you know, what works for whom, who are the stakeholders here, and it's going to be a big tension in this kind of evaluation. But I just wanted to kind of think about the importance of explanatory models and theory models, and I think you've been doing a lot of qualitative work, from what I understand, Paul, and the team that are engaged, and, you know, building that sort of theory model will be very important before moving into the step of the measurement framework too. So that's probably enough from me.
Thank you. Helen.
Yeah, I was just reflecting on some really large evaluations that I've been in the past, where they tried to do all things for all people, and they'd really struggled not just to reconcile the very different views that they bring up, but how you explain what the finding is at the end of it. So if you have multiple and contradictory findings within the context of one evaluation, it can be really difficult when people are saying, well, what do you mean? You know, inevitably at the end of it, you've got a limited amount of time with a public servant or a member of the public who say, well, does it work or not? And you launch into a kind of long and nuanced account around that. It could be a real challenge. And so so there's an issue in doing all of those in one evaluation, breaking bits down into other ones, and to say, well, we're doing this component of this because we think this is a real issue that has emerged or that people were worried about before. We're going to look at this over here because of these reasons, and to cluster it as a series of activities. Some of them may be on quant data, some may be highly qual, some could be dialogues. There's a range of different things to do. And then to bring those different forms of evidence together and make kind of judgments around success at the end of that process can be a bit easier than handling in one framework.
Thank you very much. Nicole, are you happy to comment?
Yeah, and I guess, you know, everyone sort of touched on, you know, who are we evaluating in this policy? And I suppose, you know, if our people weren't involved in the first place, so it would be like measuring how many pears are on a mandarin tree. And I guess I was reflecting on what Helen had said earlier, that we often measure based on implicit values. And as we know from our yarn yesterday. What if those values have been unequivocally shaped and built on a foundation of racism and exclusion? And of course, the legacies of colonisation unfold every day for our people, and this is why we don't see ourselves in the measures that have been brought forward. I didn't see things like cultural safety there on the measures that were mentioned, and that's of course linked very strongly with trust and social and emotional well-being, or what non-Indigenous people call mental health. But I don't think that means that it's all doom and gloom. I think if we genuinely decide the who involves our people and the what involves equity, and there's a willingness, I suppose, to share the power and ownership over that evaluation and apply things like the Indigenous data sovereignty principles, then, as Ian alluded to, I think there could be incredible opportunities about unveiling who is being excluded by the systems that govern our society.
Thank you. Richard.
Apologies, Paul. Did you want me to come in on the comment in the chat?
Yep.
Yeah, so my latter comment in the chat was basically something which I think popped up briefly earlier, but might be worth really thinking hard about at the outset going into an evaluation, was just thinking, what are the possible pathways following the evaluation? What if we find, as one example, evidence of law breaking? Will prosecutions ensue? We know that there have been misgivings, and I personally am very sympathetic to the critics here, of some of the operation in, for example, the Netherlands and to a degree in Belgium. So what will be the consequences thereafter of findings in one direction or another? So actually thinking, what is the pathway, rather than here's the data, the end, rather here's the data, what next?
Thank you. Stephen Duckett, would you like to come in here? And can I ask you, you're a former bureaucrat, and you know what the government will be looking for. If the issue was not voluntary assisted dying, but mandatory mask wearing for COVID, the government wouldn't be focusing, at least at this stage, on the public health issues, but on whether they could win an election out of it. Clearly, the objectives are really highly specific, and they can be redirected or even contaminated by the political process. From the point of view of the department and the government, what sort of things will they be looking for here?
So, Paul, one of the big lessons of political science is that the government doesn't think with a single brain. So you've got to think about who are you talking about, and what the bureaucrats might want and what the Minister for Health might want. And this report will be delivered to a future Minister for Health who may or may not support voluntary assisted dying and so on. So I posted in the chat, one of the themes that's been coming out from tonight is that I think one of the themes, or my lesson from one of the themes, is we shouldn't think about it as an evaluation. It should be an evaluation framework or an evaluation strategy that has multiple parts. And I don't think we can forget that there are still people who oppose voluntary assisted dying. There are still people who worry about pressure on families and slippery slopes and all those sorts of things that have to be talked about and looked at, and because they are an important part of people's experience. So there are things that might be uncomfortable for people who support assisted dying as well. But there are also going to be technocratic things that the bureaucrats might want to know about, that the members of the voluntary assisted dying review panel might want to know about. And the evaluations, if I can use that as a plural, need to be thinking about different audiences and different components of evaluation. How to make this better, which doesn't do violence to the legislation or doesn't start all the debate all over again, because I think it's going to be relative. You've got to think about, do you want to have airtime? Do you want to open this debate up again? There are risks and so on. And coming to the point about illegal activities, of course, any or many aspects of social science research involve how do you ethically deal with the issue that you might uncover illegal activities, surveys of drug users, for example, being a good example.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to ask Linda Sheehan to make a comment, and then I'm going to ask people to comment on what needs to be changed. And that might include how the law might need to be amended or how the processes might be amended. And I'll ask Charlie and Cameron and Michael Dooley and Mitchell and others to maybe to make some brief comments about where they think, and Greg Mewett, where we might go next. So maybe you can just think of some brief pithy comments along those lines. Thanks, Linda.
Thanks, Paul. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Look, I guess just really briefly, I think one of the key problems in the lead up to legalisation in Victoria, but actually more broadly in this debate for the last 30 years, is really that everybody did have, as Ian said, those very polarised, non-deliberative views, and we were sort of stuck in our camps, in our corners, and not coming together and having that really hard conversation that really prevented us kind of going deep into the real clarity about two things. Number one, what it is that we think matters related to this, and then I guess what legalising VAD was supposed to achieve in that light. So I kind of want to just reorientate us back to Helen's comments that whatever you evaluate really is dependent entirely on what you think matters, on those values that you thought were prioritised by legalisation, and then the potential risks that were associated with prioritising those values, and then looking deep and hard about whether or not you have indeed honoured those values or achieved those values, and at what cost in terms of risks and or harms in the broader sense. So I guess just, to finish off, I echo Ian's points. I think, this conference in particular has sort of demonstrated that we're now all allowed to say exactly what we think and how we think it in a really careful and deliberative way. And I think that piece was unfortunately missing prior to legalisation, but I'm very pleased to see it here now.
Thank you. That's a beautiful comment. Cameron, what should change?
For me, Section 8. So I'd just get rid of Section 8, or at least I'd change it to match the other sections so that there's no prohibition on you raising the issue of voluntary assisted dying. And I also think the federal laws on the federal carriage laws should also be clarified. So they're the two main things that I think could immediately fix a lot of problems. Because, yeah.
Yeah, great. Charlie, what should change?
Unmute. Definitely the two things that Cameron said definitely should change. I think we have to consider institutional objection. We see a large number of areas where the boss says we're not doing it, and every staff member is then obliged to not speak about it and not respond to patients, despite the fact that within organisations, generally in public hospitals, 80% of staff are positive about it and would wish to respond, but are told by their boss that they can't. So where does the justice come in that, and how do we navigate that? I think that's an area we really have to consider, because it's leading to quite a lot of moral distress within organisations.
Thank you. Mitchell, what do you think should change? If you're still there, Mitchell. Maybe not. Greg Mewett, what do you think should change?
Hi, Paul. Yes, I agree with, definitely agree with Cameron in Section 8, not being able to raise the issue of VAD amongst other end-of-life choices needs to be abolished, as it has not been taken up in other states. The other thing that's really important, and as a practicing palliative care physician doing VAD with patients, is some of the rubbish that we have to go through to ensure someone is an Australian citizen. The unnecessary delays in getting paperwork in place for those things needs to be closely looked at, and as has been looked at and refined in, for example, Queensland. There are a number of other issues like that that need to be looked at. And as I said before, really, that we need to look at, as everyone has probably agreed, is that are these so-called 68 safeguards that the government then sort of spouted and was sort of being thrown back at us throughout the world, are these, in fact, many of these safeguards obstructions to equitable and fair access to this end-of-life choice? I could go on for hours about what could be changed, but these are some of the things that structurally and we need to look at in order to gain better access without actually reducing true safeguards which need to be in place.
Okay, thank you. Mitchell.
Yeah, Paul, sorry, I'm having some electronics issues here and I've had to move to my laptop. Look, I support what's been said, particularly what Paul just said. And I think there'll be flow-on effect and has been flow-on effect around the country where the acts have omitted various things, for instance, coercion. I won't go on. I'll let everyone else speak a bit more.
Thank you. Alex, what do you think should change?
Well, I agree with Cameron in terms of practical problems. I think just a broad comment about the debate. I think there should be an ongoing acknowledgement that it continues a debate. And I remember Ian Kerridge talking earlier about the worst outcome could be that we think it's all fixed. So I think we need to maintain this sort of insistence on review and ongoing review for fear that someone thinks it's all sorted.
Thank you. Michael Dooley.
Look, I think it's been interesting seeing the legislation in the other states around self-administration versus practitioner administration. I think for Victoria, we need to not have the requirement for self-administration first and then prac administration. That should be changed. I think there's a whole range of steps that we do that aren't necessary, but are required by the department that have been put in place, which I think was fair enough early on, but don't need requirement now are practical barriers. I think the issue about the institutional perspective, I think, is really critical because we do see people put in very, very difficult positions when they're supportive of patients' choices, but that may be at odds with who they report to and put them in significant difficult positions. The carriage stuff has got to change. That does make life incredibly difficult for many, many people. And of course, the issue of raising, which again has been changed in other states. So I think there's a lot to change, and I think Victoria did it reasonably early on because it didn't want to get too many things wrong and be problematic. But there is certainly many things that could be changed and should be changed.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask Stephen Duckett, Ian Kerridge, Ian Olver to make comments, and then I'll hand over to Jenny Phillip to close. Stephen.
Thanks, Paul. I think Parliament passed this legislation with a whole lot of safeguards, and we've never know whether if we had 63 safeguards, the legislation would have been passed, and so on. So I think we've got to be very careful about saying, let's get rid of some safeguards. So I would be opposed to changing the coercion rule, the raising rule, for example, because I think that was an important safeguard. So we've got critically important safeguards and what might be called bureaucratic obstructions. And I think that there are some of these things that are not really safeguards, but were in the list of safeguards that I think the Parliament would be prepared to accept changes to. But I think we've got to be very careful about saying, this is now the baseline and we're going to extend it to 12-year-olds and all these sorts of things. I think that would just raise a lot of anxiety and take a lot of parliamentary time, and I just don't think it'll be worth doing. So yes, we should do some changes, but not zillions of them.
Thank you. Ian Kerridge.
Just quickly on Stephen's point, I think safeguards, a series of safeguards in law emerged for reasons of political compromise rather than because of considered ethical argument. So I think if the safeguards have generated perverse ethical consequences, then they should be changed. If they still function as appropriate and well-argued ethical safeguards, then they should stay. But at least we've opened up the possibility of which areas need review. I'd like to just echo something that Charlie said, which is the notion of institutional power. particularly sort of veto or conscience powers. I think that is a really important one. The same issues have arisen in relation to religious hospitals that function as part of the public system as opposed to a clearly demarcated religious healthcare institution. If they function as part of the public system, then just as we would ask questions about provision of emergency contraception or contraception to patients who are receiving teratogens on clinical trials within those hospitals, then equally we should be asking about the capacity of those hospitals, if they are providing end-of-life care, to actually have grounding sort of exclusions of the entire institution from provision of what's regarded as a right of access.
Thank you. Ian Olver.
Well, look, I'd like to deal with two issues. First of all, I think I agree with Cameron and many of the other speakers that if we've brought in this legislation with public support, we shouldn't be paralysing it because of bad decisions which were perhaps politically motivated. And I think the carriage laws were brought in for one reason and now they're an obstruction. And I don't think we can properly evaluate that unless we get rid of what are really artificial barriers. But that doesn't mean getting rid of the ethical safeguards. So I think we've got to be careful which is which. But you see, that's how you can start bringing groups together, because there are non-controversial things where I think most people don't want flawed laws. And if that's, so we can all agree on that and then work out, you know, the extremes might be a little bit more difficult to reconcile, but there are some clear issues here that are inappropriate barriers that I think we could see resolved. And then we'll be able to evaluate the true impact on society of this type of legislation.
Thank you very much. We've reached the end of our time, so sadly I have to draw this this wonderful discussion to a close. We've raised and covered a wide range of issues, not to complete consensus or to a firm conclusion, but I think that many of the complexities and subtleties of the issues have really been brought out very eloquently. I'd like now to hand over to Jenny Phillip to maybe give a bit of an overview and to draw the entire conference to a close. Thanks, Jenny.
Thanks, Paul. And thank you again, everyone, for what's been a really rich and wonderful discussion, and one of ones that we've been having over the whole week. Paul said at the beginning that we've touched on, or in fact delved in depth in a number of domains related to VAD, including initially the global context, the individuals, the law, the clinicians and society, and then tonight evaluation. And I'd like to add my sort of thing that I would change in the evaluation part, which is something that's been exhorted, I think, throughout, and that is that actually an evaluation needs to be part of the legislation in a more formal way going forward. So it needs to be funded and built in. But I think yesterday Ian Kerridge said it, and then it's been echoed again today, that this is actually not the end of the matter. This is the conversation, the ongoing conversation. And I think that this reflection and sharing and the thoughtful discourse that we've had really must be ongoing. It's clearly what we've been doing over this week, bringing things together, challenging and being challenged, and I have been, but also giving space for these thoughts. And I think that's been the spirit that it's enabled. As said earlier, leading up to the VAD legislation, the debate or the discourse was not friendly, and it was very polarised. And I don't actually think that it's necessary that we've been able to do it differently over this week. I don't think it's necessarily because people are feeling less strongly or that views have necessarily moderated. I actually, some may have, and I think that probably some are still the same, but I think that people have come together with a different spirit, and I think that's been enormously productive. We've been able to have this wonderful, civil, thoughtful, and very generous discussion. So thank you. I think the other thing that's been interesting coming out of this week's sort of discussion, this people forum, which is Paul's term, is that it has been able to be achieved, I think, virtually. I know you had to work pretty hard, Paul, to promote the inclusion and the discussion, and I imagine you're paddling hard under the Zoom camera. But I'd suggest that it's been another really useful outcome to prove that this is actually a methodology that works. It is possible to be inclusive and productive, and that this generous discourse can result. So my thanks to the speakers over the past week, to the panelists, to those attending, and for your comments and thoughts and reflections, which have continued to spark the conversation along. And long may that conversation continue. I guess also we can continue it in this format if and as we must. So thanks, Paul, and I'll hand back to you.
So thank you. And I'd like to add my thanks to all the speakers, the panelists, and all the other participants. I'm very grateful for your openness and generosity, as Jenny just said. I'd specifically like to thank Camille La Brooy for all the huge and amazing work that she's put into putting this whole thing together, and to James Cohen for his superb technical work, which was completely flawless. So thank you everybody, and thank you for the sense of an open, respectful conversation that we can have about an issue that really has been very difficult over the last few decades. Thanks for our national and international speakers. Thanks, Richard, again for joining us. And I would just like to echo Jenny's hope and the hope that other people have articulated, that this conversation can continue in a similar productive vein into the future. So thank you, everybody, and goodbye.